everyone, and welcome to this ADAA webinar. My name is Dr. Deborah Kissin. I'm the co-chair of the Public Education Committee for ADAA. That's the Anxiety Depression Association of America. And welcome to this webinar. Before we get started, I just want to tell you a little bit about ADAA. ADAA is a leading nonprofit in the field of anxiety and depression. Our mission is to improve diagnosis and promote the prevention, treatment, and cure of anxiety, depression, and stress-related disorders through education, such as this wonderful webinar, which we're excited to offer, practice, and research. We work to end stigma and get the word out that these conditions are real, serious, and treatable. And I want to invite you to visit the ADA website and its fabulous resource, adaa.org, and you'll find a great list of treatment providers that are trained in cognitive behavioral therapy, CBT, through the Find a Therapist page. And I also want to invite you to join the free peer-to-peer online support group, and you can support ADA by making a charitable donation on the website. So let's get started today. I'm extremely excited to have with us Dr. Singley, Dr. Daniel Singley. Dr. Singley is a San Diego-based board-certified psychologist. His research and practice focuses on men's mental health with an emphasis on reproductive psychology and the transition to fatherhood. Dr. Singley is the director of the Center for Men's Excellence, and he's the past president of the American Psychological Section on Positive Psychology, and he currently serves on the boards of APA, Society for Psychological Study of Men and Masculinity, as well as Postpartum Support International. In order to give new fathers tools that they need to be highly engaged with their infants and partners, he conducts trainings and presentations around the country, and he founded the nonprofit Basic Training for New Dads, Inc. In his free time, Dr. Singley likes to cook, surf, that's very exciting and fun, read, and take his two sons on hikes to get muddy and throw rocks at things. Sounds like much fun. All right, so we are going to switch it over so you could share all of the great information that you have prepared to share with us.
All right. Well, thank you very much for that intro. I really appreciate you, Dr. Kissin, as well as the ADA having me on to talk about this specific subset of depression and anxiety and mood issues, meaning looking at men and paternal perinatal mental health. So I wanted to first just maybe say a little bit. So I am a San Diego-based psychologist, and my focus is generally on men and men's issues, and my research is on paternal perinatal mental health, in particular fathers' involvement with their infants, what predicts it, what does it look like, and so on. Looking at the learning objectives, just to give you a sense of what we're going to be talking about, first, we're going to talk about masculinities and what it means to be a man or male identified, and sort of sets the stage and the platform upon which the fatherhood role is generally built. Then we're going to look at specifics of father involvement and, of course, how it relates to mental health. And then we're going to look at what does the research say are ways to work with fathers and understanding to have when doing this kind of work. And that point at the bottom, that snarky bit about sexism and heterosexism and so on, I don't identify as any of those, but it's just sort of my way of drawing attention to the fact that this is sort of an overview talk about fathers and early fatherhood and the psychosocial transition to fatherhood. And while there's some research about dual dad couples or offender reentry for new dads, or African American dads, Asian American, Latino, and so on, in general terms, I'm going to be talking about what the research says, and the research tends to be more general, although we'll make some pointed exceptions to that. So, Dr. Kissin, you did mention that I work as part of the board of directors of Postpartum Support International, and our mission is to serve as a bridge to connect people, moms, dads, other non-birth partners, and family members who are struggling with mental health issues in the perinatal period from conception to about a year or so postpartum, with the resources and the providers that can help them. And in my role there, one of the events that we conduct that I'm really excited about is International Father's Mental Health Day, which is the day after Father's Day. It was June 18th this year. And embarrassingly, I haven't updated my slide for what it's going to be next time. But you can get more information about it. Also, as part of PSI, I conduct a monthly phone call. It's the Dad's Chat that dads from all over the country and sometimes internationally will call in. And it's just a nice forum where expectant and new dads that are having some difficulty or their partners having difficulty can call in. There tend to be a lot of resources for moms along these lines, but not so much in terms of getting the dads together. So I mentioned that as a really nice resource, and strongly encourage folks to recommend dads as appropriate. So if you have difficulty with salty language, then you don't want to look at this slide. But I bring this interestingly. So today is August the 3rd, and a colleague of mine, friend and colleague David Levine, as well as Catherine Berndorf, they were on the Megyn Kelly show today talking about paternal postpartum depression. And usually the first point is that a thing? Sometimes it's even worse than it's not a thing, and folks will really shame and reject and go after dads who talk about experiencing this sort of thing. And so I just did a screenshot. Excuse me, I did a screenshot of some of the comments from a similar kind of video that was posted in, and it's terrible. So more than anything, I just wanted to say, of course, I'm aware of what some of the biases are out there, but hopefully doing a presentation like this can work against them and provide some work against the stigma and some facts. So I showed this graphic just to set the stage that even though, in movies and Hallmark commercials and so on, we see, as soon as you have a baby, you flower and your life becomes the best it's ever been, and it's, rainbows and sunshine and unicorns and so on. And for some folks, that is the case. But in many cases, the period immediately postpartum, be it the fourth trimester or that first couple of years or so after the birth, can be very difficult. And because there is such a strong societal assumption that parenthood is this natural thing and everybody gets it and it's great, there's a lot of shame associated with struggling or not feeling connected with your baby or having depression or anxiety or substance abuse issues. But I show this slide just because it reflects many years of psychological and sociological research that basically says that the relationship between marital satisfaction on the y-axis and then time on the x-axis is a big U, meaning that right around the time when stereotypically a couple is beginning to have children and raise them, statistically, their sense of satisfaction in their marriage, in their relationship is taking a precipitous slide. Now, this is a statistic like any other, so it doesn't necessarily have anything to do with any one person or couple. Some couples, their satisfaction stays very high, it goes low to high, goes high to low, stays the same. But I raised this point because I work exclusively with men, or the women that I see are generally part of a couple. And to me, one of the pleasing take-homes of this point is part of the recipe for that slide in marital satisfaction are some of the ways that we train men and boys not to be very good in terms of managing or staying ahead of their mental health difficulties, not necessarily being prepared to be the best teammate, and not necessarily knowing how to communicate well, in particular, how to fight fair. So we're going to go over some specific ways that you can identify these sorts of things, but also work against them. And so I like to show this picture to dads and couples just as a way to frame, like, hey, you don't have to be a statistic. There's plenty to do about it. So this slide sort of sets the stage for an understanding as old school masculinities. Some researchers did, a nice cross-cultural look at what does it mean to be a man or to be masculine across a number of different countries and cultures. And, if you take a look at it, those pictures on, those powerful, older white males on the right-hand side, they sort of reflect the zeitgeist within which that research was done. And on the left-hand side, you see in order what those researchers found. The first was that in order to be masculine in your culture, whatever it means to be feminine in that culture, just don't do that. And so in many ways, traditional masculinity is very reactive in the sense that it's about not being feminine and in some ways denigrating or being misogynistic or you're being against femininity. The rest of them are, of course, being powerful and having a lot of status. You're the big wheel, you're a shot caller, being an expressive, whatever happens, no matter what, I'm the sturdy oak and the storm rages around me. Nothing knocks me off my spot. Last is, you're adventurous and aggressive. You'll jump out of planes and, shoot people or take a bullet for somebody or be sexually predatory or whatever. Issue being that these tenets reflect what I call the bro code or the guy box. And what the guy box provides is protection from shame. So men and boys who enact these aspects of masculinities, they are not running the risk of being shamed. They can stay forever in the guy box and be comfortable there in that sense. However, it leaves them generally very unhappy and very isolated. And we'll talk more about men and vulnerability and some of the issues there. But as it relates to fatherhood, in particular father's mental health, if you're going to go at this traditional bro code version of masculinity, well, then the assumptions that go along with it are, well, the dad's role is, protect, provide. I got to, keep the saber-toothed tigers away and keep food on the table and generally not involved with the pregnancy, not so much in the birth or with infancy. The dad sort of shows back up when little Joaquin is old enough to walk and kick a ball or throw a ball or something. But dads that are in this vein tend not to be good teammates. They're not very emotionally available. They're not, particularly empathetic. And the thing that's funny is you ask yourself, did Chuck Norris change diapers? Heck no, he didn't. The reality is he did. Chuck Norris was actually a highly involved dad who I was probably knee deep in diaper changing at the time. So fast forward to now. Gender roles are shifting in Western societies slowly and surely, but there are a couple of major events that set the stage for, psychosocially what the current cohort of fathers are experiencing. One was the feminist and women's liberations movements of the 60s and 70s that have allowed a lot more women to be in the workplace, to be professional, so you have considerably more representation there. Another is the Great Recession of 2008, which was a major financial hit to people in general, but in this case, fathers lost their jobs, and so had, potentially, if it's a heterosexual couple, then their wife was, going to work, and both of those together have resulted in a lot more dads staying home, a lot more dads being highly involved in domestic duty and care. And so I call this Daddy 2.0. And to me, nowhere more so than in fatherhood is the evolving nature of the male gender role evident. Because I do a lot of presenting and rarely does anyone say, no, it's not a thing that dads are expected to be more involved now than previous generations were, because they're all over the place. In mid-90s, a couple of researchers coined the term generative fathers, and there are others, responsible fathers, involved fathers, good fathers. Most of them point to the same basic idea of dads that are much more highly involved and engaged with, even with their infants. But in order to enact that kind of fatherhood, now society, much more than ever, and of course there are all sorts of caveats about different groups, different racial ethnic groups, internationally, different cultures and so on. But generally speaking, for dads to keep up with current expectations of fatherhood, they need to do some things which are the opposite of the bro code, in the sense that being nurturing and being very hands-on with the baby, and instead of going with the bumbling dad, I don't know what I'm doing, and put the diaper on the kid's head and then hand it back to my partner, they're open, they're available, they're changing diapers, they're soothing, they're swaddling, and also doing the same in terms of openness with their partner. one big issue being that there aren't really very many models to show this more involved generative fatherhood, in particular for fathers of infants. So it's getting better in the sense that if you watch American football, then you'll commonly see in the Super Bowl around halftime and see these commercials with these big buff athletes that are wearing tutus and having a tea party with their daughters, and they're sending a very clear message that you can be tough and you can also enact some sort of traditionally feminine things and hang out with your kid and it's all good. The problem is you don't see that as much for the fathers of infants, and because stereotypically the current cohort of fathers, their own fathers were not particularly involved with them as infants. I see this as a kind of generation gap that the current new dads tend to experience. All things being equal, if their model of a father of an infant was to be fairly uninvolved, then when the stress and the difficulty of becoming a father hits, they may, contrary to what they were expecting beforehand, go on their sort of autopilot and go on the model of their own father and be pretty uninvolved right at a time when they were expecting to be right in there, and their partners were as well. So going against these traditional masculine norms is one factor that is a mental health implication for the experience of depression and anxiety and other mood disorders in the perinatal period. One of which is just the changing of roles. Becoming a father and the role changes that happen brings ambiguity and uncertainty, which of course means adjustment and some level of stress. In terms of prevalence, 1 in 10 fathers gets clinically significant symptoms of postpartum depression. Between 2 and 18% develop some kind of anxiety disorder, not just feeling worried, but actually meeting criteria for generalized anxiety disorder, PTSD, OCD, and so on. Which, when you look at those are big, big public mental health numbers that we just tend not to deal with. Having a history of mental health issues, including abuse, especially abuse in family of origin or trauma around the family or parents, are of course risk factors for the development of either new or recurrence of existing mental health issues like depression, anxiety, substance use, relationship difficulties. That in red at the bottom, gender role conflict basically refers to the experience of stress that one has when going against traditional societal norms for her or his gender. And when experiencing gender role conflict, men tend to have higher levels of mental health difficulties, and they engage in significantly less help seeking. And I want to make this point right on the front end, so I'm going to say this point. If you only remember one thing from this talk, remember this, and then you can go to sleep until you have to do your vow. But it goes like this: if you're going to do anything, just one takeaway: do not, for any reason, just tell expectant or new dads that their job is to support their partner, and that's it. It is very important for them to be supportive of their partners. However, dads need support themselves, and they need support beyond what any one person, including their partner, can support them. So when you talk about support and the relationship, it's critically important to set expectations with dads. Hey, you're going to need support too. The difficulty is that the dominant narrative in parent education along these lines and what's generally referred to as maternal mental health is, Dad, you're a support player. And that makes it even harder for dads to own up to having mental health difficulties and certainly asking for help. And the research certainly says that mental health help seeking in men and expectant and new dads goes way down. So I like this slide. Basically what I did was rip off these bullet points from a Department of Health and Human Services Office of Child and Family and Schnauzers, I can't remember the whole, but they put out this lovely publication called The Importance of the Father and the Healthy Development of Children in 2006. And I included these bullet points because they very succinctly spell out, all right, what does it mean to be a good dad these days? That's it. And so the work that I do with men, I'm very concrete. I'm all about handouts and worksheets and specific tools and techniques and so on. So I actually have this info put into the format of a checklist and a handout that I will give to dads and couples. And, you know, it's not an accident that the very first bullet point is fostering a positive relationship with the child's mother. And so I want to revisit. I'm being very heteronormative in this talk. I'm talking about mothers and fathers, and particularly here in Southern California, there are all kinds of different family constellations, you know, from dual dads to lesbian moms to polyamorous couples and so on. But I just, in this case, we're talking, this is how it was done in that article or in that publication. The relationship between the birth parents has consistently been shown to be one of the most important factors in the father's involvement with the baby, and in many ways, the child's development down the road. So it's not an accident that that's first. Similarly, spending time and nurturing, you don't discipline an infant, you just you love them and hug them and give them boo-boos, and down the line, knowing how to give appropriate discipline becomes very important. Serving as a guide to the outside world is a particularly dad kind of way to go, you know, strap on a baby and go walk around. Hey, look, there's dirt, there's a tree, and, you know, of course, moms do the same sort of thing as well. Protecting and providing tends to be sort of central casting for what people think about the fatherhood role, and then, of course, being a role model. Well, what I do with this info is, like I said, I have a handout checklist, and I give it to the dads. And we'll say, you know, sometimes they're like, yeah, I'm not sure. I'm not, my partner and I were not on the same page about what to do. And that, you know, I will give it to them and say, look, here's what you do. At the end of every single day, you go down this list and ask yourself, can I identify one concrete behavior that I did today that's related to having a positive relationship with the child's mom, with spending time with it, and so on? Yes, check. If not, circle it. Whatever you circled, make sure you do that tomorrow. Do this every day for the rest of your life, and you're being a good dad. And it's that, not to oversimplify, but that tends to be very comforting to a lot of the dads that I work with who feel totally overwhelmed by the role and the changes in their relationship and you know, and financial demands and work-life stress and so on. But the overall point is just be highly involved. Like the reality is in parenting education, there are all these different ways of saying you have to be this kind of parent. You have to nurse this way. You can't use bottles. You have to baby wear. There are all these different ways, and pretty much everybody says mine is the one-size-fits-all approach. And I don't do that because I think it's a great disservice to the complexity and the diverse backgrounds of parents and new dads these days. But what I do stand on is dads have to be involved. They need to be engaged, and whatever that looks like in their family context can be totally different, but just don't be checked out and uninvolved. So this bit about assertive communication gives some insight into a really common skill that I go over with my patients, because as I alluded to in that marital satisfaction slide, guys don't tend to be all that good about having productive communication, in particular around conflict. And so I commonly use this, of course I have a handout for this, a worksheet, to just spell out, hey, look, communication exists on a continuum. Aggressive is far on one side, passive is the other, assertive is in the middle. That means I'm looking at my needs and yours. And this is a way to address the common dynamic in which dads are going for the win. Like they try to use facts and stack logic and research and so on, and or they just jump to the fix when there's some kind of an issue and don't stop to actually find out, hey, like what's going on? And I don't just mean with partners, and this is what we socialize boys and men to do this with everybody. So when I'm training someone on assertive communication, I tell them first, just do not try to fix it. Just right off the bat, don't lead with that. Don't try to be the smartest guy in the room. Don't try to be the fix. Lead with wanting to understand. So ask 3 open questions that are designed to get a better sense of, what does she or he feel about this? What does it mean? Not what do you think we should do? After that, lead with a restatement. Okay, so you said A, B, and C. And then, only then, should he follow up with, all right, here's where I'm coming from. But again, not where I'm coming from in terms of what to do. You got to wait for that. The guy needs to be able to follow up with, well, here's what this means to me, and here's what's difficult. And again, guys tend to not be used to communicating at that level. Your average guy or dad, if you ask him about an interaction they had with somebody else, he'll describe it as if he's watching a movie. It's got a very external frame. So getting men and fathers to include themselves in their own experience in how interactions play out takes work. Like, I don't just explain this assertive communication to somebody and then they have their triple black belt in it. It takes practice and repetition. So I included this info related to what I was saying earlier about fathers needing social support. This is an article from last year where the authors were looking at, it's a qualitative study asking dads, what do they want in terms of supports? And I distilled it down to these basic points. They want supports that are more informal, so not necessarily coming into my office or reading, a pediatrics journal. They want it ideally from other dads. And I see this all the time. A lot of females and non-male identified clinicians do great work with dads. But in many cases, all things being equal, specifically for fathers, they tend to really be hungry to get input from other fathers about their experience. And C is important because it's this whole on-the-fly thing, meaning they're not necessarily doing a whole bunch of research about, what's going to happen in 6 months or a year or 5 years down the road. It tends to be a sort of reactive way of looking for resources or people or information. And in some cases, that can contribute to a very common dynamic in which potentially the mom has done a whole lot of reading and, what to expect and you're expecting to expect and books and tomes and this, and she'll give the father materials to read and he doesn't do it. And then he's bad for not doing it. And so I just sort of talk with both of them about it. It doesn't necessarily mean that he's not doing his own version of this and wanting to gain understanding and insight in what to do. It just might look different than the way his partner is. And that last bullet point is, if you're a clinician, or if you're not a clinician, if you're buddies with a dad or the partner to one, take a close look at social isolation. And social isolation, you can be very isolated and around people all the time. You can be very withdrawn, so you don't look isolated, but this is a key aspect to pay attention to. Related to that isolation, I've developed an application. It's a social networking site specifically for fathers, only for fathers. So, developed by and for dads. It's called PadreCadre.com. There's no fee for it. There's no predatory marketing. I just, after years of knowing the research and working with a bunch of dads, said, look, let's do something that at least provides a virtual community where the fathers can meet up with each other. So you log in and you can message other dads. There's a mentor program, wikis and forums and so on. But there's also a geolocation function so that dads who go in and set up a logon, they can actually look on a map and find other members that are close to them. And so unlike most social media applications, my goal with this thing is they find each other in it and then they get offline and then they meet each other face to face and they can talk about, hey, what kind of things are you doing in the community? What do you know about? Like, just as a way to connect. So in this slide, I included a quick overview of the research that gets at the question, so what's the big deal about dads, in particular new fathers' involvement with their infants? Because in many ways, we're socialized to believe that the parenting of infants is really mothering, is best done by mothers. And in fact, there's no research to support that. There's no research to show that either one, that either gender or any gender does it better. But in terms of having a highly involved dad in the first year, so this is all involvement during that first year postpartum, the children tend to have down the line higher IQ, more vocabulary words, greater school readiness. They engage in better emotional regulation. We're going to talk a little bit more about that. And they tend to be more empathetic. Obviously, they have more of a sense of attachment and to be more secure. And because of that empathy and willingness to go explore a bit more, they tend to be even more popular and have a sense of independence. The fathers themselves tend to experience fewer mental health issues when they're highly involved. And the causality thing here is important. We don't know yet whether or not it's that dads with fewer mental health issues tend to be more highly involved, or as a result of being more highly involved, the dads tend to have fewer mental health issues. We know they go together. Along with being more highly involved, the father, of course, gets a greater sense of self-efficacy or confidence and a higher sense of satisfaction with parenting, as well as his relationship. Like, you can't, and when you do this kind of research, you cannot get away from the centrality of the relationship between the mother and the father and their well-being, but also the child's long-term well-being. Turns out it's also good for mom to have a highly involved dad in the first year. The moms tend to have fewer mental health issues and to be more responsive both to dad and baby, and to have a higher level of their own self-efficacy and confidence, and to be more effective. So this slide I include partially because this one is my wife's favorite slide in the entire deck. Of course, because she really likes pictures of babies. I think that speaks for itself. But I included this slide because it gets at some of the most common top-level barriers that prevent dads from being more highly involved with their infants. First, if you have a blended or inconsistent family structure, so a father that has had children with multiple mothers or just different family constellations than just a traditional mom, dad, baby, that has been clearly shown to relate to decreased level of involvement with children and infants. Substance use. If the father is, drunk and passed out, he's not going to be very involved with his child, or if he's, on meth and up in a tree, and he's not going to be involved with his child, nor do we want him to be. That bit about socialization just speaks to the point I was making earlier, which is that in general, we think of this area as maternal mental health, and we think of the postpartum as being more sort of the domain of women and moms. And that itself can result in dads not feeling as confident or likely to go with their baby, to be highly involved. This bit about self-efficacy and other efficacy is important. So self-efficacy refers to my confidence in my ability to engage in some specific activity. So changing a diaper, giving a bottle, soothing, swaddling, bathing, having a more open, vulnerable conversation, whatever it is, my self-efficacy about that behavior tends to be the strongest predictor of whether or not I will actually do it. So other efficacy refers to somebody else's belief about my ability to do it. And so when you think about this in the context of the mother-father relationship, and this is where to be clear, I love moms and women, and by no means misogynistic or sexist, just this is well documented in the literature. It's fairly common to see what's called gatekeeping, or in particular maternal gatekeeping, where the mom will have some level of anxiety about, safety or germ contagion, or just, how to take care of the baby, and will actually keep dad at a distance. Or in some cases, if mom has a very low sense of other efficacy in the father, she might that might be also part of what's going into her serving as a barrier or a gatekeeper, or she might follow him around and sort of redo what he does or criticize what he does. The issue is that tends to further erode the father's sense of self-efficacy. And so then he's less likely to get involved. And then you get into this terrible spiral of anxiety and resentment and wanting to be involved, but feeling less confident, and the relationship suffers. And frankly, I see quite a lot of that. And it's totally manageable, but it begins with some psychoeducation about paternal involvement and the nature of anxiety, and being willing to take sort of slow, steady, small steps to test out concerns about anxious outcomes. Obviously, if CPS is involved, or there's a custody case at play, then sometimes you have supervised visits or no visits at all. And work-life balance. For dads that are working 3 jobs, trying to pay the bills and cover what they need to, of course they're not going to be that involved with their children or their infants because they're out doing it. Plenty of moms do the same thing. Here in Southern California, the most common setup is, in order to live here, to afford it, both partners need to work. And of course, on both ends, that can really attenuate the level of involvement that they have. So I at the risk of being an overeducated white guy that says, oh, we're going to have the diversity slide, as opposed to incorporating it throughout the talk, I did want to draw attention to some specific factors that I think are important, but not the most common ones you think about. And these are protective factors against mental health and in support of fathers' involvement with infants. So in the Latinx culture, familismo reflects the value of family coming first and being highly involved in the family. And so in obvious ways, that that would involve the father being present, and we think more about, machismo or him being machista. And while of course that's a factor, familismo has been shown to be a protective factor in getting the fathers involved. Also, having multi-generational homes. So very commonly, Native American, African American, and like Latinx, Asian American, a lot of different cultures very commonly have homes where you've got grandchildren, even great-grandparents all living together. And in some ways that can help facilitate the father being involved, but also some of the research that my team has done has actually shown that the presence of familial supports can also decrease the amount that the father's involved in certain ways, because he may just sort of outsource it and say, oh, the kid's good, the kid's involved. So it's important to watch. There are some nuances to pay attention there. And dual dads. So these are our gay dad couples, and I bring them up under protective factors. There's some research on these couples, but very little. There's more on lesbian mom couples. But just from personal experience, what I've seen is that in order for these dads to go through the process that they need to get a child, to legally adopt it, and so on, that those children tend to be the most loved babies ever, because it's taken so much time and so much money, and the process tends to be really difficult. So I've raised that as, typically those babies tend to be pretty lucky. Now, in terms of risk factors, we think about SES or, alcohol or relationship issues. One that I see consistently is what's called historical trauma. And historical trauma briefly refers to a person's experience of being involved with a member of a marginalized group that's been marginalized throughout history. So if you think about Native Americans in the United States, African Americans in the United States, Muslims, Jews, or with all different kinds of groups. But this draws to bear on paternal mental health, in that I've worked with a number of fathers who have said, it's been tough for me and my people. We've gotten the tough end of the stick for generations and generations, and I'm about to bring a baby in, and they'll reflect on their own experience of microaggressions or even straight up macroaggressions, and it can bring up a sense of trauma related to that part of their life and their identity, and then they really worry, but when I'm bringing another little baby into this world who, she or he might experience the same thing. So this can be a risk factor to pay attention to that not everyone is clued into. Both high and low SES can be risk factors for mental health difficulties. I've seen plenty of situations where folks get to my office and they had terrible postpartum depression or anxiety, but basically got blown off by other therapists and psychiatrists saying, look, you drove up in a Mercedes, like you're good to go. There's actually an example of a friend of mine, David Achille in New York. His wife, Alexis, had terrible postpartum depression, and they were very out front trying to get help, and were told by a psychiatrist, well, even though you're saying you're suicidal, you're too pretty to kill yourself. This is a true story. And then tragically, she did. So in that sense, low SES as well as high SES are factors to bear in mind. And we talked about rigid socialization. If you stick in the guy box, then you're probably not going to be very involved with an infant. So briefly, this slide highlights what several researchers, there's Michelle Paquette up in Montreal, and the Grossmans, they're a husband and wife psychologist team of researchers. They research, it's a complementary approach to just attachment. So traditional attachment theory, a la, Bowlby and Ainsworth and Main, looks at the primary attachment figure and, how children connect, but it's almost exclusively about moms. And so the research and the methodology has grown up typically looking at the maternal-child relationship. Well, these researchers said, well, hey, we think the way that we're conceptualizing attachment and the way that we're measuring it is not factoring in some of the nuances of dads, and in particular what they call the paternal activation relationship, which is the father's tendency to encourage his child, even young toddlers, to engage in controlled risk-taking relative to what moms tend to do. It's very important to recognize that, just at this point, a 2005 meta-analysis male and female psychosocial characteristics, basically found that men and women are about 70% the same, and there are some other differences. So what I'm saying now, it can go towards moms and women as well. It's just these researchers are specifically looking at what are some more unique aspects of fatherhood and how do we measure them, and then what do they do? And typically what research in this vein has found is that the children who have highly engaged fathers who encourage them to engage in this importantly controlled, not just random risk-taking, to be more agentic and independent and likely to go out and explore the world and have more confidence. So I set up this chart to reflect, and I love using this. Of course, it's also part of a handout that I like to give to dads and couples. Briefly, on the y-axis is arousal at the level of the infant's central nervous system, low to high, and then time left to right on the x-axis is, you know, now to then. And the orange line shows the infant's central nervous system arousal as a result of stereotypical fathers, more what the Gottmans, John and Julie Gottman, refer to as the more gross motor, jazzed up parenting style. And so if you look on the right, you got that, you know, the guy throwing up the baby there. Think along those, or, you know, or vigorous Superman zooming around. But for the child, what the result is the dad throws the baby up, throws the baby up, throws the baby up, and then puts the baby down in the bassinet, walks off and checks his phone and comes back. So as a result of this, you know, jazzed up style, the baby tends to have a very, very high level of arousal central nervous system, then gets put down and self-regulates. This is the important part. Self-regulates to an even lower intensity emotional state, stays there for a little while. Then the dad comes back after, you know, checking his Instagram account or whatever, and then starts it all over again. Revs the baby up, gets him very, very, you know, high, and then the baby has the chance to self-regulate and self-soothe down to a much lower intensity state. And stereotypically, plenty of moms do that stuff as well, and dads go the other way. Stereotypically, moms tend to engage in more sustained, soothing, lower intensity play, in particular with infants and younger babies like toddlers. And so, you know, the baby holding on, or the mom holding the baby and sort of slowly rocking, you know, the wheels on the bus go round and round, that sort of thing. The baby just doesn't have that higher level of arousal, and so then therefore doesn't also have the ability to downregulate and self-regulate emotionally. So I like to use this information, in particular with some of the gatekeeping couples, to show that even if dad's behavior is anxiety provoking to mom, not only isn't it necessarily bad, but here's some research which suggests that it's actually super good. Like, back to that finding that children with highly involved dads tend to do better at emotional regulation. Well, the research isn't there to prove that this is a key mechanism there, but it does lend itself to that idea. And so I really like to, you know, give this information, and I'll commonly see light bulbs going off about, hey, you know, just because I parent differently than my wife or my partner or the mom, that doesn't mean I'm bad or wrong. In fact, it can mean I'm actually being very, you know, helpful. Briefly, so my research is on paternal involvement, and so my team and I have developed a self-report scale. If you're interested, I'm happy to give it to you. I will talk ad nauseum about my research and you know, be a narcissistic, self-absorbed psychologist. And these are some examples of those items. So we broke it down into 5 different dimensions of paternal involvement: positive engagement, indirect care. We used emotional frustration because it's a kind of emotional involvement, then warmth and attunement, and then that higher order control and process. And there are clear implications for fathers' involvement as a result of having anxiety, having depression, having substance use issues, where they're less likely to engage in a lot of these behaviors.
Dr. Singley, I'm just injecting myself.
Sure.
Question for you. What do you think, if there's one thing a viewer or listener can do today to try to make a change? If there's one thing that's kind of the low-hanging fruit, what comes to mind that can be the first thing that a father who may be struggling can do?
To manage his mental health?
Yeah, to get more to get more involved with the role of fatherhood, to manage his mental health, any struggles that he might have with postpartum challenges.
So first, don't just try to stuff it and move on. It's the most common mistake. Don't self-isolate. Don't try to stuff it and move on. And also be aware that if his partner has postpartum depression, that he's got a 50% chance of developing it himself. Although, as you see on this slide, commonly it looks different. It looks like frustration, irritation, anger. Maybe I've got chest pains or muscle tightness. It starts with just not denying it and being aware and not sort of shutting down and withdrawing.
Right.
But beyond that, go talk to somebody about it as much as possible. Don't just sort of stuff it and try to keep driving the car even while they're flat. Actually, you know what? Let me fast forward to, I have some other, how about this? So on this slide, this is some real brass tacks. So what? So what do you do about it? I call this the new dad's game plan because these tend to be interventions that are very helpful for dads and couples, and particularly if there's some mental health difficulty. So one of the things is, even if the dad is experiencing depression or anxiety or like this, I hear all these arguments. Dads will say like, well, I'm the hunter and she's the gatherer and I can't do anything, and she has the boobs and so I can't, and I kind of turn that on its head and say, no, actually you can do everything. You can do absolutely everything to care for your baby except nurse the baby. And you can and should be doing that in partnership with your partner as soon as possible. So this speaks to the don't avoid the fatherhood role piece of things. Another one is the scaffolding pieces, particularly for fathers of infants. I think it's really important for them to learn about their child's development. A lot of dads will say, looks like nothing's going on. Kid just lays there. So finding out about motor development, cognitive development, language development, and so on, tends to help the dad to feel comfortable about what's going on with the baby. How do I interact with the baby? And those next two, the State of the Union meeting and the family operations meeting, the State of the Union meeting tends to be the most impactful intervention that parents around this time get. And briefly, the State of the Union meeting is like a 5-minute, once-a-week meeting. A 10-minute State of the Union meeting is long. But in the State of the Union meeting, the partners sit down and tell each other 3 things in this order. What's something that's going well in our relationship? What is something I'm struggling with in our relationship? And what's something that you, my partner that I'm talking to, what's something that you have done that helped me to feel loved, cared for, and connected? Dad tells the mom tells the dad, and they just listen. They can only ask questions to better understand, but there's no minimizing. You can't get defensive. You can't start shooting down. In fact, I have a handout for this one too. The instructions are, you got to wait 6 hours until after you do the State of the Union meeting until you can circle back and say, okay, based on what we talked about, what if we do blank or such? That tends to be a really, really important intervention because it gets the couple, and in particular the dads, communicating proactively and in a balanced way, not just waiting until there's some capital E event and then they have to do a stress debrief. So that one intervention, if you're going to do anything, I would say to do that and to do it in a way where you are communicating assertively and openly. Family operations is about, you have to have a shared calendar and review it, and then also build in their self-care. So it's not just logistically what do we have to get done. And on the next slide, you'll see the pieces of self-care that I see as essential for people in general, but I'm talking about fathers. Oftentimes I get questions about, what can partners do and how to talk with dads. Where you see that thing about providing more than materially, be the best you. So in my work with men, one of the key aspects of how I operate is I don't shame them for being men. Even if they're going at something differently than the way that I would. I work really hard to meet men and fathers where they already are. And one of those is taking this idea of being a provider and saying, what does that mean to you? And usually it means material resources. Well, what I like to make sure the dads understand is that there's plenty of research to support the point that after you get to, beyond basic needs, that the research supports the idea that one of the best things a father can provide is the best version of himself. And men and fathers are not used to thinking of ourselves as something that we provide to our babies and to our partners. So I take this idea and say, look, man, if you're spun out or you're having some difficulty and you're just trying to stuff it and move on, the reality is your family deserves the best version of you. And so you need to do whatever it takes. Go talk to somebody, take some time outs, whatever, self-care, but they deserve the best version of you. So provide that to them. That's much more important than that next toy. And so a lot of times I'll talk with partners and moms about how they can take that idea and sort of bring it to if their partner, their husband is struggling. The assertive communication we talked about, diversify the social support portfolio. This basically gets to the point that a lot of dads are isolated and they need to have 4 sources of support, 4 legs on a table. They need 4 sources of support other than partner and family. And I teach a class here in San Diego, so feel free to have a destination vacation to come take it. But then, of course, also getting therapy as needed. I included this slide as key aspects of self-care. These are sort of the 4 pillars. Sleep, of course, it's a huge thing for new parents, but particularly for people if you have depression, anxiety, bipolar disorder, schizoaffective like this, or thought disorder, sleep is essential to maintaining stability, particularly in the transition to parenthood, as is diet, having a reasonably well-balanced diet so that you're not having appreciable weight gain or loss, and engaging in some kind of exercise. It doesn't even have to be going to the gym. It can be going for a nice 20 to 30 minute walk and being reasonable about what exercise looks like. And of course, the social support piece for dads just not being isolated. So did those points address what you're asking about?
Yes, I'm sorry. I was cut off for a second. Did you hear me?
Sure. Mm-hmm.
Oh, I'm sorry. Oh, I thought you were just asking me a question. I'm sorry. Go on.
Yeah, no problem. You're realizing, we're coming up on time.
Right.
I also have a slide here about what can partners do, and some of this we've already talked about, but ideally just let dad do his thing and get alone time as much as possible and take successive approximations, make sure they both get their social support needs met and that there isn't a bunch of guilt about it. And of course, because maternal postpartum depression is the #1 predictor of paternal postpartum depression, if mom herself is feeling irritable, angry, depressed like this, managing her own mental health is something that she does not just for herself, but also for the father. I include this slide just because if you don't have a father-inclusive workplace, then you're unlikely to be able to do too much that's going to make much of a dent. So think about it. Is your clinic, your setting, your wherever it is that you work, how affirming is it? Here's a list of resources that I like, some of which are mental health, some of which are just really good about early fatherhood, entertaining, funny, Padre Cadre, obviously, and the Postpartum Support International. I strongly encourage dads that are experiencing mental health difficulties and early fatherhood, call in. Gaddit is a social media site that has it's a chunk of Reddit that's got a really involved community of fathers. More references, and finally my tag here, which is fathers, you cannot babysit your own kid. That's called fathering. And it always hacks me off when somebody will say, well, he's staying home to babysit his kid. I'm like, no, it doesn't work that way. So realizing I zoomed through the last part, any other thoughts or questions?
No, I think this is such an important topic, and we at ADAA are so glad to be able to offer all this helpful material. And I think there's probably some good questions that viewers are starting to think through and how this impacts their own life. So if anyone does have any questions, feel free. You could just email us at webinars@adaa.org and include in the subject line Dr. Singley, and feel free to put in there your thoughts or questions, and we'll make sure to get them to Dr. Singley. And thank you again for this great presentation, and hopefully we can have a part 2 at some point in the future, because this is an area it's hard to cover just in an hour. So thanks for packing so much in there.
Sure. So thank you very, very much for having me on, and I'd be happy to do it again sometime.
Okay, all right. Well, have a great weekend and we will talk to you soon. Thanks a lot.